There's nothing quite like the moment you realize you might never see your family again. Staff Sergeant Ryan Hale felt that crushing weight as he hung upside down from a Montana pine tree, blood pooling in his head, watching darkness creep across the forest. His training exercise had gone wrong in the worst possible way. Ryan's gear was scattered below him, his radio destroyed, and his concussion made thinking nearly impossible. Every breath was getting harder. Then he heard barking. A golden retriever walked out of nowhere, looked right at him, and sat down as if to say, "I'm not leaving." The dog stayed there all night, barking at sounds Ryan couldn't hear. What this loyal stranger was about to do would save Ryan's life and teach him something profound about never giving up on people. How did this dog know exactly where to find him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ryan Hale had never been comfortable with vulnerability. At 38, with 3 tours in Afghanistan behind him, he'd learned to compartmentalize everything: pain, fear, loneliness, even joy. It was what kept soldiers alive in places where one moment of distraction could mean death. But back home in the States, that same armor had become a prison. He sat in his truck outside the training facility in Montana, watching other soldiers gear up for what their commanding officer called a routine wilderness exercise. Nothing about military training was routine, especially not when you were dealing with combat veterans who'd seen too much. Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, the symptom that had been getting worse since his last deployment ended 8 months ago. The call from his mother 2 weeks earlier still echoed in his mind. "Ryan, honey, we barely hear from you anymore. Your father's worried sick. We all are." He'd hung up after 5 minutes of stilted conversation, another bridge he couldn't seem to cross anymore. The distance between him and his family felt as vast as the mountains surrounding this training ground inside the facility. Ryan went through the motions checking equipment, listening to briefings, nodding at the right moments. But his mind was elsewhere, caught in that gray space between past and present, where memories of Kandahar mixed with the Montana morning air. He'd volunteered for this exercise, hoping that familiar military routine might help quiet the noise. In his head, 50 miles away, Sarah Mitchell was having her own conversation with isolation. She stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse that had been in David's family for 3 generations, holding his simple gold wedding band between her fingers. 2 years since the tractor accident that took her husband, and she still wore the ring, still turned it when she was nervous, which was most of the time these days. At 34, Sarah had never imagined she'd be running a farm alone, especially not while raising an 8-year-old son who missed his father with an intensity that broke her heart daily. Tommy was outside now, throwing a tennis ball for Buddy, their golden retriever, the one constant source of joy in their increasingly difficult world. Buddy had been David's idea, a puppy for Tommy's 6th birthday, just months before the accident. "Every boy needs a dog," David had said, scratching behind the puppy's ears as Tommy squealed with delight. Now Buddy was one of the few connections Tommy had left to happier times, and Sarah protected that relationship fiercely. The farmhouse creaked around her, a sound that used to represent home and stability, but now reminded her of all the repairs she couldn't afford. The kitchen window overlooked 200 acres of land that her great-grandfather had farmed, where David had planned to teach Tommy everything about working the soil and caring for livestock. Instead, Sarah faced each morning with a growing list of problems and a shrinking bank account. She walked to the window and watched Tommy and Buddy playing in the yard. The boy had David's stubborn cowlick and gentle way with animals, but there was a sadness in his eyes that no 8-year-old should carry. He'd stopped talking about his father in past tense, as if keeping David in the present might somehow bring him back. "Buddy, fetch!" Tommy called, hurling the ball toward the tree line that marked the beginning of the national forest. The golden Retriever bounded after it with boundless energy, disappearing momentarily into the shadows before emerging with his prize. Sarah smiled despite herself. Buddy had grown into exactly the kind of dog David had hoped for: loyal, intelligent, and completely devoted to Tommy. The dog had an adventurous spirit, often wandering to the edge of their property to explore the forest trails, but he always returned by dinner time. It was one routine Sarah could count on in a world where so little felt certain anymore. The ring felt heavy in her palm as she considered the stack of bills on the kitchen table. The bank had been patient, but patience had limits. David's medical expenses from the accident, combined with the declining income from a farm she was still learning to manage alone, had created a perfect storm of financial pressure. She slipped the ring back onto her finger and returned to the bills. Each envelope a reminder of how far she'd drifted from the life she'd planned. Tommy's laughter drifted through the window, and she held on to that sound like a lifeline. Whatever happened, she had to keep his world as stable as possible. Back at the training facility, Ryan was checking his rappelling gear for the third time. His squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, approached with the kind of casual confidence that Ryan envied but could no longer access. "Hale, you good to go?" Martinez asked, noting Ryan's obvious tension. "Roger that, Sergeant." The lie came easily. Ryan had become an expert at appearing functional while struggling to hold himself together. The exercise was designed to test wilderness survival skills, navigation, shelter building, emergency procedures. For most of the soldiers, it was an interesting challenge. For Ryan, it was another opportunity to confront the growing disconnect between the soldier he'd been and the man he was becoming. As they loaded into transport vehicles, Ryan caught his reflection in the window, hollow eyes, jaw clenched tight, shoulders carrying invisible weight. He looked like what he was, a warrior without a war, struggling to find purpose in a world that suddenly felt too quiet and too loud at the same time. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd survived multiple combat deployments only to find himself undone by the peace he'd fought to protect. But that's the thing about invisible wounds. They don't show up on X-rays or earn you Purple Hearts. They just eat away at you slowly, one sleepless night at a time. The convoy moved toward the mountains, carrying Ryan toward a collision with destiny that neither he nor the Mitchell family could have imagined. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest moments: a dog's curiosity, a storm's fury, a soldier's willingness to keep going, even when every instinct told him to surrender. Sarah went back to her bills. Tommy continued playing with Buddy, and Ryan stared out at the Montana wilderness, each of them unaware that their lives were about to become permanently intertwined through the loyalty of a golden retriever who understood something about love that the humans had forgotten. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply refusing to leave someone behind. The storm came from nowhere, the way mountain weather often does: one moment clear skies, the next a wall of dark clouds rolling over the peaks like an advancing army. Ryan felt the first drops of rain as his squad reached their insertion point, a rocky outcrop 3 miles into the Glacier National Forest. "Looks like we're about to get wet," Martinez called over the increasing wind. The exercise called for teams to split up, each soldier navigating independently to predetermined checkpoints before regrouping at base camp. It was meant to test individual survival skills, but now Ryan wondered if they should stick together. His radio crackled with static as the storm intensified. "Base to all units, weather moving in faster than predicted. Maintain radio contact and consider early extraction if conditions deteriorate." Ryan checked his gear one final time, noting the coil of rappelling rope that would be essential for the cliff descent to checkpoint 2. His hands moved automatically through the equipment. Check compass, first aid kit, emergency beacon, water purification tablets. Everything was there. Everything was secured. At the Mitchell farm, Tommy stood at his bedroom window, watching the same storm clouds gather over the forest where Buddy loved to explore. The 8-year-old had drawn a crayon map of all the trails and clearings where he and Buddy had adventured together, carefully marking the creek beds and the old oak tree where they'd built a fort the previous summer. "Looks like a big one coming," Sarah said, joining her son at the window. "Better make sure Buddy's inside before it hits." Tommy nodded and headed downstairs, his hand-drawn map still spread on his desk, a child's attempt to catalog the wilderness that bordered their property. The map showed trails colored in brown crayon, streams in blue, and special landmarks marked with stars. To Tommy, that forest was magical territory that he and Buddy explored like brave knights seeking adventure. "Buddy!" Tommy called from the back porch. The golden retriever was nowhere to be seen, probably investigating something interesting at the edge of the property. This wasn't unusual. Buddy often disappeared for an hour or so, following scents and sounds that only he could detect. The first crack of thunder made Sarah jump. Montana storms could be vicious, especially in the mountains. She checked the old gate that separated their property from the forest, making sure the latch was secure. David had always meant to replace that gate. It was one of dozens of items on his perpetual fix-it list that Sarah now faced alone. "Buddy!" Tommy called again, more urgently this time. The wind was picking up, bending the pine trees that marked their property line in the forest. Ryan was discovering that military equipment sometimes fails at the worst possible moments. His radio had gone silent, victim of either the storm or the mountainous terrain that blocked signals unpredictably. He was alone on a narrow ledge, preparing to rappel down a 60-foot cliff face that would bring him to checkpoint 2. The rope felt secure in his hands as he began the descent, but halfway down he felt something give way. Not the rope itself, but the anchor point where he'd secured it to a boulder that looked solid but proved treacherous. Ryan had a split second to register what was happening before the world turned sideways. The fall wasn't far, maybe 20 feet, but it was enough. His safety gear tangled in tree branches, leaving him suspended upside down from a pine tree, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. The impact had scrambled his thoughts, turning the world into a confusing kaleidoscope of pain and disorientation. At the farm, the storm hit with sudden fury. Lightning split the sky, followed immediately by thunder that rattled the farmhouse windows. Sarah heard the old gate bang open in the wind and cursed David's procrastination about fixing that latch. She pulled on her rain jacket and headed outside to secure it. The wind fought her every step as she struggled with the gate. The latch mechanism was bent, probably from years of weather and neglect. As she wrestled with it, she didn't notice. A golden shape slipped past her into the forest, drawn by some instinct older than domestication. Buddy had never ventured this far from home, but something was calling him deeper into the woods. The storm that sent other animals seeking shelter seemed to energize him, as if he understood that somewhere in the darkness, someone needed help. Ryan's vision swam as he tried to assess his situation. His gear was scattered on the forest floor below him, including the emergency beacon that might summon rescue. Blood from his head wound made it difficult to see clearly, and the upside-down position was making him nauseous and disoriented. He tried to reach the knife on his belt to cut himself free, but the angle was wrong, and his head injury was affecting his coordination. Every movement sent waves of pain through his skull, and he could feel consciousness slipping away. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Not alone in the forest, not hanging like a broken marionette while a storm raged around him. Ryan thought about his parents, about the phone calls he'd avoided, and the conversations he'd put off. He thought about all the ways he'd let fear keep him isolated from the people who loved him. The forest was a maze of shadows and sounds as Buddy pushed deeper into unfamiliar territory. His keen nose picked up something troubling, the scent of blood, human fear, and something else that made him whine softly. He'd never encountered anything like it, but every instinct told him to follow that scent trail. Back at the farm, Sarah finally managed to secure the gate and ran back to the house, soaked and exhausted. Tommy met her at the door, his face tight. "With worry. Mom, Buddy's not back yet." Sarah's stomach clenched. Buddy had never stayed out during a storm. He was too smart, too domesticated to risk bad weather. "He's probably found shelter somewhere," she said, trying to convince herself as much as Tommy. "He'll come home when it passes." But as the storm intensified and the hours dragged on, Sarah began to worry that they'd lost more than just a dog. But he wasn't just Tommy's pet. He was his connection to his father, his source of unconditional love, his reason for getting up each morning with enthusiasm instead of dread in the forest. Ryan felt his strength ebbing as the storm raged overhead. The cold rain soaked through his clothing, and the head injury was making it hard to think clearly. He tried calling for help, but his voice was weak, and the storm swallowed the sound. Then he heard it barking. Faint at first, then growing closer. Ryan's first thought was that he was hallucinating, but the sound was too real, too purposeful. Someone's dog had found him, though he couldn't imagine how or why any animal would be out in this weather. Buddy emerged from the underbrush like a golden ghost, his coat matted with rain and pine needles. He looked up at Ryan with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to assess the situation with surprising clarity. Then he sat down at the base of the tree, tilted his head back, and began to bark. It wasn't the excited barking of play or the aggressive warning bark of a guard dog. This was something different, urgent, purposeful, almost conversational. But he was trying to communicate, and somehow Ryan understood. "Good boy," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Good boy. Stay with me." And Buddy did. Through the long, terrible night, as Ryan drifted in and out of consciousness, the golden retriever maintained his vigil. He barked periodically, always in the same urgent tone, as if he understood that persistence might mean the difference between life and death. Ryan had no way of knowing that this dog belonged to a widowed mother and her young son, or that his disappearance was causing them anguish. He only knew that he was no longer alone, that something had chosen to stay with him in his darkest hour. As dawn approached, Ryan's strength was nearly gone. The cold and the head injury had taken their toll, and he wasn't sure he'd see another sunrise. But Buddy remained at his post, faithful as a guard dog, determined as a soldier, refusing to abandon his post, even as the storm reached its peak fury. It was a lesson in loyalty that Ryan would remember for the rest of his life. Sometimes salvation comes not from strength or strategy, but from the simple refusal to give up on someone, even when giving up would be easier. Sometimes love is just showing up and staying, no matter what. Dawn came slowly through the storm clouds, gray light filtering through the pine canopy, like hope refusing to surrender. Ryan's rescue whistle lay somewhere in the scattered deer below. Him, useless and silent, while the golden retriever who'd appointed himself guardian maintained his faithful watch. Buddy had been barking intermittently through the night, but as morning approached, his vocalizations became more urgent and sustained. He seemed to sense something Ryan couldn't detect, the approach of other humans. Somewhere in the forest, Jim and Carol Peterson had been hiking these trails for 15 years, but they'd never heard anything quite like the sound that reached them as they attempted their morning walk despite the previous night's storm. It wasn't the usual forest chorus of birds and small animals. This was something else entirely persistent, purposeful barking that seemed to come from deep in the woods, well off any established trail. "That's not normal," Carol said, pausing to listen as the sound echoed through the trees. She was a retired veterinarian, and something about the tone of that barking set off alarm bells in her professional mind. Jim adjusted his backpack straps and consulted their topographical map. Could be someone's hunting dog got separated from its owner. But Carol was already following the sound, her instincts overriding her husband's more cautious nature. "No, Jim, that's not hunting behavior. That dog is trying to tell us something." They pushed through wet underbrush, following game trails and creek beds as the barking grew louder and more distinct. Carol's years of treating animals had taught her to read canine communication, and this dog was definitely in distress. Not injured distress, but the kind of urgent calling that meant emergency. Ryan drifted in and out of consciousness as the morning progressed, each period of awareness shorter than the last. His vision was blurry, and the constant flow of blood from his head wound had left dark stains on the forest floor below. But every time he opened his eyes, that golden face was there, watching him with unwavering attention. "Still here, boy?" Ryan whispered during one lucid moment. His voice was weak, barely audible, but Buddy's ears perked up and his tail wagged slightly. The first sign of joy the dog had shown since finding the injured soldier. The sound of voices reached them both. At the same time, Buddy's barking intensified, becoming almost frantic with excitement, while Ryan tried to call out but managed only a weak croak that wouldn't carry far in the dense forest. "There." Carol pointed toward the sound. "I can see him, the dog." "He is?" "At the base of that big pine." Jim squinted through the morning shadows. "I see him, but what's he barking at?" "There's nobody." He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes adjusted and he spotted the figure suspended in the tree branches. "Jesus Christ." "Carol, call 911. Now." Carol was already pulling out her satellite phone, one of the essential pieces of gear for serious hikers in this remote area. "Yes, this is an emergency. We have an injured person trapped in a tree, approximately 3 miles northeast of the Glacier Creek trailhead. He appears to be unconscious and bleeding." Jim approached carefully, talking to Buddy in soothing tones. "Easy, boy. We're here to help." "You did good. You did real good." The golden retriever seemed to understand that help had arrived, but he didn't move from his position at the base of the tree. "Sir, can you hear me?" Jim called up to Ryan. "We're going to get you help." Ryan's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, he thought he might be hallucinating. 2 strangers were looking up at him with concern and determination, while his canine guardian continued his faithful watch. "The dog," Ryan managed to whisper. "He stayed. All night, by the looks of it," Carol said, ending her call with emergency services. "They're dispatching a helicopter from Kalispell. Should be here within the hour." Jim was already unpacking climbing gear from his backpack. As an experienced mountaineer, he carried rope and hardware for emergency situations, though he'd never imagined using it for a rescue like this. "We need to stabilize him before the helicopter arrives," Jim told his wife. "That position can't be good for blood flow, and he's obviously concussed." But their immediate concern was getting close enough to assess Ryan's condition without making things worse. The soldier was suspended at an awkward angle, held by his tangled gear in a way that could prove fatal if they tried to move him incorrectly. But he watched their every movement with intelligent eyes, seeming to approve of their rescue efforts. He had relaxed slightly now that help had arrived, but he still refused to leave his post. Whatever instinct had brought him to this spot wasn't satisfied yet. At the Mitchell farm, Sarah had barely slept. She'd spent the night checking the doors and windows, hoping to hear Buddy's familiar scratch at the back door. Tommy had crawled into her bed around midnight, worried and unable to sleep without his 4-legged best friend. "He's never stayed out all night," Tommy said for the 10th time as they sat at the breakfast table, neither of them touching their food. Sarah tried to project confidence she didn't feel. "But he's smart, honey. He probably found somewhere dry to wait out the storm. He'll come home today." But as the morning wore on and there was still no sign of the golden retriever, Sarah's worry deepened. She'd already called the local animal shelters and posted on social media, but the responses were all the same. No one had seen a golden retriever matching Buddy's description. The thought of losing Buddy felt catastrophic, not just for Tommy, but for her own emotional equilibrium. The dog represented continuity, the last piece of the life they'd built with David. Without him, their small family would feel even smaller, their farmhouse even emptier. Back in the forest, the rescue operation was becoming increasingly complex. The helicopter couldn't land in the dense woods, which meant they'd need to create a clearing or find an alternative extraction method. Jim had managed to rig a stabilizing rope that took some of the pressure off Ryan's suspended position, but the injured soldier was growing weaker. "How long has he been up there?" The paramedic asked over the radio. Carol checked her watch and estimated the timeline based on when the storm had hit. "At least 12 hours, probably longer. The dog's been with him the whole time, I think. That's what kept him alive." Buddy had become an integral part of the rescue operation, his presence somehow providing comfort and focus for everyone involved. When the helicopter finally arrived and lowered a rescue specialist, the dog remained calm and cooperative, as if he understood that his job was nearly complete. The extraction itself was delicate work, freeing Ryan from his tangled gear without causing additional injury, stabilizing his neck and spine, then lifting him carefully into the helicopter's rescue basket. Through it all, Buddy watched from below, his tail wagging slightly as he saw his charge being taken to safety. As the helicopter lifted off with Ryan inside. Heading for the trauma center in Kalispell, Buddy finally moved from his post. He sniffed around the base of the tree, as if making sure he hadn't missed anything important, then began the long journey home through the forest. The golden retriever had no way of knowing that his night of faithful watching had just changed multiple lives. Forever. He only knew that he'd done what felt right, what something deep in his canine soul had demanded of him. He'd refused to abandon someone in need, and that refusal had made all the difference. At the trauma center, as medical teams worked to assess and treat Ryan's injuries, the story of his rescue began to spread. A soldier saved by a mysterious dog that appeared from nowhere and stayed through the worst of the storm. It was the kind of story that captured imagination and offered hope in a world often short on both. But for now, Ryan was unconscious and fighting for his life while 50 miles away. A golden retriever was making his way home to a family that had spent the night fearing they'd lost him forever. None of them yet understood how their lives had become permanently intertwined by one night of extraordinary loyalty and courage. The helicopter touched down at Kalispell Regional Medical Center just as the morning shift was beginning their rounds. Ryan was rushed into Trauma Bay 3, where Dr. Patricia Martinez, no relation to his squad leader, began the careful work of assessing injuries that could have easily been fatal. Severe concussion, possible skull fracture, multiple lacerations, she announced to her team as they cut away Ryan's sodden military gear. Blood pressure is low, probably from the head injury and exposure. Get me a CT scan and start him on warm saline. The white plastic hospital bracelet they clipped around Ryan's wrist seemed oddly fragile for something. Meant to identify a man who'd survived multiple combat deployments and a night hanging upside down in a tree. It bore his name, date of birth, and medical record number, clinical details that said nothing about the loyalty of a golden retriever or the kindness of strangers who'd risk their own safety to help him. Ryan drifted in and out of consciousness. Throughout the morning, his dreams filled with golden fur and steady brown eyes. Each time he surfaced toward wakefulness, his first words were about the dog that had saved him. "Where's the dog?" he asked a nurse during one lucid moment. "Is he okay?" The nurse, a veteran named Patricia, who'd seen her share of confused patients, assumed he was hallucinating. "There's no dog here, hon. You're in the hospital. You're safe." But Ryan's agitation increased rather than decreased. "You don't understand. There was a dog, golden retriever. He stayed with me all night. Someone needs to find him." Word of Ryan's rescue had already reached his commanding officer, who arrived at the hospital with the kind of grim expression reserved for soldiers who'd pushed their luck too far. Colonel Harrison had seen too many good soldiers lost to training. Accidents and Ryan's situation could have easily joined that tragic list. "How is he, Doctor?" Harrison asked as Dr. Martinez emerged from the trauma bay. "Stable, but he's got a significant head injury. The exposure didn't help. He's hypothermic and dehydrated. Another few hours and we might have been having a different conversation." Harrison nodded grimly. "What about this dog story?" "The hikers who found him said there was a golden retriever at the scene." Dr. Martinez consulted her notes. The rescue team confirmed it. Apparently, the dog stayed with him through the night, barking to alert potential rescuers. It's actually not that unusual dogs have better senses than we do. They can detect distress from remarkable distances. But what was unusual was the dog's persistence, the apparent decision to remain with a stranger through dangerous weather, when every instinct should have driven him to seek shelter. The story was already spreading through the hospital, one of those small miracles that reminded everyone why they'd chosen careers dedicated to healing. 50 miles away, Sarah was experiencing her own kind of trauma as the morning progressed. Without any sign of Buddy, she'd expanded her search to neighboring properties, walking fence lines and calling his name until her voice was hoarse. Tommy had refused to go to school, convinced that Buddy would return and need him to be there. The 8-year-old sat at the kitchen window with his hand-drawn map spread before him, studying the crayon trails and landmarks as if they might reveal his missing friend's location. "He knows these trails," Tommy insisted when Sarah suggested. "They might need to expand their search further. Look, Mom, he goes to the creek first, then up to the old lightning tree, then around to the rocky place where we saw the deer." The map was a testament to childhood friendship and adventure, carefully drawn paths marked with stars for special places, X's for where they'd found interesting rocks or feathers, smiley faces for clearings where they'd stopped to rest and play. To Tommy, every line represented a shared memory with his beloved companion. Sarah studied the map with new eyes, recognizing that her son understood Buddy's habits better than she did. While she worried about practical things like traffic and predators, Tommy knew the landscape of their friendship, the routes Buddy preferred, the places that held special meaning for a curious dog. "Maybe we should follow your map," Sarah said finally. "You know him better than anyone." They set out together, Sarah carrying her cell phone and a first aid kit while Tommy led the way with the confidence of someone who'd walked these paths hundreds of times. The storm had left the forest damp and fresh-smelling, with small streams running higher than usual and the scent of pine sharp in the cool air dot at the hospital. Ryan was becoming increasingly agitated as the effects of his concussion began to clear. The medical staff had expected confusion and disorientation, but they hadn't expected this singular focus on a dog that none of them had seen. "I need to find him," Ryan told Dr. Martinez during his afternoon examination. "He saved my life. Someone needs to make sure he's okay." Dr. Martinez sat on the edge of his bed, recognizing something important in his urgency. "Tell me about the dog. What do you remember?" Ryan's voice grew stronger as he recounted the night, the golden retriever appearing out of nowhere, the decision to stay despite the storm, the faithful barking that had ultimately brought rescue. "He didn't know me," Ryan said, his eyes filling with tears that surprised them both. "He had no reason to stay, but he did. All night, through the worst of it, he stayed." The doctor made a note in Ryan's chart, but it wasn't about medical symptoms. She was beginning to understand that this patient's recovery might depend as much on reuniting with his canine rescuer as on treating his physical injuries. "We'll make some calls," she promised. "There are ways to track down lost dogs, especially in a small community like this." Meanwhile, Tommy and Sarah were discovering that following the hand-drawn map was more challenging than expected. The storm had changed some of the landscape. Fallen trees blocked familiar paths. and swollen creeks had altered their usual crossing points. But Tommy's knowledge of Buddy's habits proved invaluable. At the lightning tree, an ancient pine scarred by an old strike, they found fresh paw prints in the mud, evidence that Buddy had passed this way recently. He was heading toward the big forest, Tommy observed, studying the prints with the seriousness of a professional tracker. That's not normal. He doesn't usually go that far. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. The big forest was thousands of acres of wilderness where a dog could easily become lost forever. The thought of Buddy wandering alone in that vast landscape, possibly injured or frightened, made her stomach clench with anxiety. They followed the trail as far as they safely could, but as afternoon approached, Sarah knew they were reaching the limits of what two people could accomplish alone. The search area was simply too large, and they lacked the resources to cover it effectively. "We need help," she told Tommy as they reluctantly turned back toward home. "More people, maybe some professional trackers." Tommy's face crumpled with disappointment and fear. What if he's hurt? What if he can't get home? Sarah knelt to meet her son's eyes, choosing her words carefully. "Buddy is smart and strong. If he's out there, there's a reason. Maybe he's helping someone else, the way he always helps us." It was meant to be comforting, but Sarah had no idea how close to the truth her words actually were. At that very moment, 60 miles away, Ryan Hale was beginning to understand that his recovery depended on finding the golden retriever who'd chosen to save his life. The hospital social worker had agreed to help track down the dog, making calls to local animal shelters and posting on regional social media groups. The story of the soldier saved by a mysterious golden retriever was already capturing public attention, and tips were beginning to come in. But none of them yet knew that the dog they were searching for belonged to a struggling farm family, or that a young boy was sitting at his kitchen window, studying a hand-drawn map and praying for his best friend to come home. The threads of their connected story were still invisible to all of them, waiting for the right moment to be pulled together. As evening approached, Ryan stared at the hospital ceiling and thought about loyalty, how it could appear unexpectedly, how it could sustain someone through the darkest hours, how it created bonds that transcended understanding. Somewhere out there was a dog who demonstrated the kind of faithfulness that Ryan had been searching for his entire adult life. He was determined to find that dog, to thank him properly, and maybe to learn something about the kind of love that doesn't count the cost before deciding to stay. The old tractor died with a shudder and a final wheeze on Tuesday morning, exactly 3 days after Buddy's disappearance. Sarah stood in the barn doorway, staring at the machine that had been the backbone of their farming operation for the past decade, and felt something break inside her chest that had nothing to do with mechanical failure. David's toolbox sat exactly where he'd left it, a worn wooden box filled with implements that had shaped 3 generations of Mitchell family life. She hadn't touched it since the accident, couldn't bring herself to disturb the careful arrangement of wrenches and screwdrivers that still held the imprint of her husband's hands. But now, faced with machinery that refused to cooperate and bills that wouldn't pay themselves, Sarah found herself reaching for tools that felt foreign and familiar at the same time. The biggest wrench was still slightly oily from David's last repair job, and the smell of motor grease mixed with Old Spice aftershave brought tears to her eyes. Tommy appeared in the barn doorway, his face still carrying the hollow look that had settled there since Buddy's disappearance. "Is it broken bad?" Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans and tried to project more confidence than she felt. "Just needs some attention. Your dad always said these old machines just need patience and the right touch." But David had possessed knowledge that Sarah was still acquiring through trial and error. He'd understood the temperament of every piece of equipment on the farm, known exactly how much pressure to apply and which part to adjust when things went wrong. Sarah was learning these lessons the hard way, usually at the worst possible moments. The Repair manual spread across David's workbench might as well have been written in a foreign language. Carburetor adjustments, fuel line diagnostics, electrical system troubleshooting concepts that David had explained to her over the years, but never fully transmitted. She'd been content to handle the administrative side of farm life while he managed the mechanical challenges. Now she faced both responsibilities alone, with a bank account that couldn't accommodate professional repairs and a timeline that didn't allow for extended learning curves. The spring planting season waited for no one, and every day the tractor remained broken was money they couldn't afford to lose. Tommy climbed onto a hay bale and watched his mother work with the kind of quiet intensity he'd inherited from his father. "Mom, what if Buddy doesn't come back?" The question hung in the barn air like dust motes, impossible to ignore but too painful to address directly. Sarah continued wrestling with a carburetor that seemed designed to frustrate anyone without mechanical expertise. "Buddy loves you too much to stay away forever," she said finally. "Sometimes animals wander further than they mean to, but they usually find their way home." It was the kind of hopeful answer parents give children when the truth is too complicated or frightening to share. Sarah had no idea whether Buddy was alive or dead, injured or safe. But Tommy needed optimism more than uncertainty. 60 miles away, Ryan was discovering that his own uncertainties were multiplying as his physical condition improved. The concussion symptoms were fading, but other problems were becoming apparent, issues that predated his tree-hanging adventure and went deeper than any physical injury. His sleep was broken and restless, filled with dreams that mixed memories of combat with images of golden fur and patient brown eyes. When he was awake, hypervigilance made him jump at every sound in the hospital corridor. The cheerful chatter of nurses and the rolling of equipment carts set his nerves on edge in ways that had nothing to do with his recent trauma. Dr. Martinez had noticed these symptoms during her rounds and mentioned them to the psychiatric consultant. "Classic PTSD presentation," Dr. Robert Chun observed after reviewing Ryan's military records. 3 combat deployments, probable traumatic brain injury from an IED explosion last year, medical discharge pending psychiatric evaluation. The medical records revealed a story that Ryan had been reluctant to share. Months of increasing psychological symptoms, difficulty sleeping, problems with anger management, and growing isolation from family and friends. The tree incident wasn't an isolated accident, but part of a larger pattern of a soldier struggling to readjust to civilian life. "He keeps asking about the dog," Dr. Martinez told her colleague. "It's become an obsession. He can't seem to focus on anything else." Dr. Chun nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes trauma patients fixate on the thing that saved them. It becomes a symbol of hope when everything else feels overwhelming." But Ryan's fixation felt different than typical trauma response. His determination to find the golden retriever seemed to provide focus and purpose that had been missing from his life since his discharge from active duty. For the first time in months, he had a mission that felt meaningful. He'd been working with the hospital social worker to coordinate search efforts, using his military training to organize a systematic approach to finding one dog in thousands of square miles of Montana wilderness. Maps spread across his hospital bed showed search grids, shelter locations, and social media contact points. "We've had 17 calls about golden retrievers," the social worker reported during her afternoon visit. "Most of them don't match the description, but we're following up on 3 that seem promising." Ryan studied the locations marked on his map with the intensity he'd once applied to battlefield intelligence. Each potential sighting represented hope and frustration in equal measure. Hope that his canine savior was safe. Frustration that the search was taking so long. Meanwhile, Tommy had convinced his mother to let him post flyers around town, complete with a photo of Buddy and a description that emphasized his friendly nature and distinctive golden coat. The 8-year-old approached the task with the seriousness of someone who understood that words might be his best friend's only path home. Missing, Buddy, golden retriever, 4 years old, very friendly, the flyers read. Last seen near Glacier Creek area during storm. Reward offered. Call Sarah Mitchell. Sarah had hesitated about offering a reward their finances couldn't accommodate additional expenses, but Tommy had insisted that people might try harder if they knew money was involved. She'd settled on $50, nearly all of their emergency cash, because the look in her son's eyes made any other choice impossible. They posted flyers at the feed store, the veterinary clinic, the post office, and every other business that would allow them. Tommy explained Buddy's story to anyone willing to listen, describing his missing companion with the kind of detail that only comes from unconditional love. He likes tennis balls better than sticks, Tommy told the clerk at the hardware store, and he always sits on my left side when we watch TV. He knows when I'm sad because he puts his head on my lap. These details wouldn't help identify Buddy from a distance, but they served another purpose. They kept the dog alive in Tommy's mind, maintaining the connection that made hope possible. As long as he could talk about Buddy in the present tense, Tommy could believe in his eventual return. Back at the farm, Sarah attacked the tractor problem with the kind of determination that had carried her through 2 years of widowhood. David's tools felt awkward in her hands at first, but gradually she began to understand their purpose and application. The carburetor came apart reluctantly, revealing problems that went beyond simple adjustment. Years of farm use had left deposits, and where that required replacement parts, Sarah couldn't afford. She sat on the barn floor, surrounded by mechanical components and fighting the urge to surrender to tears. The toolbox represented more than just implements. It was a tangible connection to David's competence and confidence. Every wrench and screwdriver held memories of problems solved and challenges overcome. Now those same tools mocked her inexperience and reminded her of how much she still didn't know about running a farm alone. But giving up wasn't an option, not with Tommy depending on her and spring planting season approaching. Sarah wiped her hands, consulted the manual again, and began the slow process of learning skills that David had made look effortless. The work gave her time to think about Buddy's disappearance and what it meant for their small family. The dog had been more than a pet. He'd been a living link to happier times, a source of comfort during difficult moments, and Tommy's primary companion in a world that sometimes felt too adult and too serious for an 8-year-old boy. Losing Buddy felt like losing David all over again. Another reminder that nothing in life was permanent or guaranteed. But Sarah was learning that loss didn't have to mean defeat, that sometimes the best way to honor what's gone is to keep working. Keep hoping, keep taking care of the people and responsibilities that remain. Ryan's breakthrough came on Friday afternoon when he cross-referenced veterinary records with social media posts and discovered a pattern that his military intelligence training had taught him to recognize. 3 mentions of a golden retriever named Buddy, all from the same general area, all posted by someone named Sarah Mitchell. The faded family photograph he found on her Facebook page stopped him cold. A man in work clothes stood with his arm around a woman's shoulders, while a young boy knelt beside a golden retriever puppy. The happiness in their faces was unmistakable, but something in the photo's timestamp suggested this joy belonged to the past. "That's him," Ryan told the social worker with absolute certainty. "That's the dog that saved me." But as he studied the Mitchell family's social media presence more carefully, Ryan began to understand that his rescue had come at a cost. Recent posts showed missing dog flyers and desperate pleas for information about Buddy's whereabouts. The family photograph had been taken 3 years ago, and more recent posts revealed a mother and son coping with loss that went far beyond a missing pet. David Mitchell had died in a farming accident 2 years earlier, leaving Sarah to manage the property alone while raising their son. The golden retriever represented far more than companionship. He was a living connection to their lost father and husband, a source of stability in a world that had already taken too much. Ryan stared at Tommy's face in the photograph and felt something twist in his chest. The boy looked exactly like Ryan had at that age, hopeful, trusting, completely secure in the love of his family. But recent photos showed shadows under Tommy's eyes and a guarded expression that no 8-year-old should carry. The address was easy to find through public records, and Ryan began planning his approach with the same careful attention he'd once applied to military operations. This wasn't just about thanking a dog for saving his life. It was about reuniting a family with their missing member, about restoring something precious that had been lost because of his survival. Dr. Martinez had cleared him for discharge that morning, though she'd recommended follow-up care for both his physical injuries and the psychological symptoms that were becoming increasingly apparent. Ryan had nodded and agreed to all her suggestions, but his real focus was on the mission that waited beyond the hospital walls. He signed the discharge papers, wearing civilian clothes that no longer felt quite right, as if his body had forgotten how to inhabit anything other than military gear. The world outside the hospital seemed simultaneously too loud and too quiet, full of stimuli that set his nerves on edge while lacking the purposeful energy that had defined his adult life. The drive to the Mitchell farm took him through mountain country that reminded him of Afghanistan in some ways. The vast sky, the sense of being small against landscape that had witnessed more history than any human could comprehend. But this was a gentler wilderness, marked by hayfields and grazing cattle rather than improvised explosive devices and hostile fire. Ryan found himself checking his mirrors obsessively and gripping the steering wheel too tightly, symptoms he recognized but couldn't seem to control. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive overseas had become a liability in civilian life, making routine activities feel dangerous and unpredictable. The Mitchell farm appeared around a bend in the county. Road like something from a postcard, white farmhouse with green shutters, red barn, pastures dotted with hay bales. But Ryan's trained eye noticed details that suggested struggle. Peeling paint, a sagging fence line, farm equipment that looked older than optimal. He parked at the end of the driveway and sat for several minutes, trying to calm his racing heart and organize his thoughts. This wasn't a military briefing or a combat operation, but his body didn't seem to understand the difference. Every instinct screamed at him to assess threats and plan escape routes. The golden retriever that bounded around the corner of the farmhouse looked exactly like the dog from his nightmares and dreams. Buddy moved with the kind of joyful energy that suggested he'd been thoroughly forgiven for his unexplained absence. But when he spotted Ryan's truck, his demeanor changed completely. The dog stopped mid-stride and stared at Ryan with unmistakable recognition. His tail began wagging with increasing intensity, and he started barking, not the alarm bark of a guard dog, but the excited greeting of someone recognizing an old friend. Tommy appeared in the farmhouse doorway, drawn by Buddy's unusual behavior. The boy looked exactly like his photograph, except for the wariness that shadowed his features, the learned caution of someone who'd experienced loss too early. "Buddy, what's wrong?" Tommy called, but the dog was already racing toward Ryan's truck with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested their reunion was long overdue. Ryan opened his truck door and found himself on the receiving end of the most enthusiastic greeting of his adult life. Buddy jumped up to place his front paws on Ryan's chest, tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled, face stretched into what could only be described as a grin. "Hey there, boy," Ryan said softly, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. "I've been looking for you." Sarah emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on a rag, alerted by the commotion in her driveway. She took in the scene, her son standing frozen on the porch, her dog acting like he'd found his long-lost best friend and a stranger in military style, clothing who looked both familiar and completely out of place. "Can I help you?" she called, moving protectively toward Tommy while keeping her eyes on Ryan. Ryan gently pushed Buddy down and straightened, recognizing the defensive posture of a mother protecting her child. "Mrs. Mitchell? I'm Ryan Hale. I think this is the dog that saved my life." The words hung in the afternoon air like a bridge between two worlds. The civilian family trying to rebuild after loss, and the soldiers struggling to find purpose after war. Sarah studied Ryan's face, noting the recent injuries and the kind of alertness that suggested military training. "Saved your life?" she repeated, confusion evident in her voice. Tommy had crept closer, drawn by curiosity despite his mother's obvious caution. "Are you the man from the storm?" he asked. "The one they talked about on the news?" Ryan knelt to Tommy's eye level, recognizing something in the boy's posture that reminded him of his own childhood. The careful evaluation of adults who might disappoint or disappear. "That's me. Your dog found me hanging from a tree and stayed with me all night until help came. He's a hero." Buddy seemed to understand that he was the subject of conversation and inserted himself between Ryan and Tommy, as if facilitating an introduction between two people who needed to know each other. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly as she processed this information. Buddy's mysterious disappearance during the storm suddenly made sense, but the implications were staggering. Her family's beloved pet had somehow located and rescued a complete stranger, staying away from home to fulfill a mission none of them could have imagined. "He stayed with you all night?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with wonder and pride. "Never left my side," Ryan confirmed. "Kept barking until someone found us. I probably wouldn't have made it without him." The photograph in Ryan's mind suddenly came to life as he watched Tommy's face light up with the kind of pride that only comes from loving someone who's done something extraordinary. This was what the boy had looked like before loss had taught him to be careful with his trust. Sarah found herself studying Ryan with new eyes, noting the way Buddy continued to lean against him and the genuine emotion in the stranger's voice when he talked about her dog. Whatever had happened in that forest had created a bond that transcended ordinary human-animal relationships. "Would you like to come inside?" Sarah asked, the invitation surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise Ryan. "I think we need to hear this story properly." Ryan glanced toward the farmhouse, then back at the woman and boy who'd shared their most precious possession with him without even knowing it. His mission had been to find and thank the dog that saved him. But he was beginning to understand that gratitude might require something more complex than a simple acknowledgement. As they walked toward the house together, Buddy trotting happily between them, Ryan realized he was about to enter territory far more challenging than any combat zone he'd ever navigated. This was a family healing from loss, and he was a soldier struggling with invisible wounds that he'd barely begun to acknowledge. But for the first time since his discharge, Ryan felt like he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. The fence repair had been going well until Ryan's vision started swimming. He'd been working alongside Sarah for 3 hours, replacing rotted posts and restringing wire with the kind of methodical precision that reminded her of David's approach to farm maintenance. But something was wrong. Ryan dropped the post-hole digger and pressed his palms against his temples, his face pale and covered in sudden perspiration. "Sorry, I just need to." He didn't finish the sentence before his knees buckled and he collapsed beside the fence line, his body convulsing in what Sarah immediately recognized as a seizure. "Tommy, call 911. She shouted toward the house as she knelt beside Ryan, trying to remember everything she'd learned about seizure first aid. "Don't restrain him. Clear the area of dangerous objects. Time the episode. Stay calm." But staying calm was nearly impossible as she watched this man who'd seemed so capable and controlled lose consciousness on her property. Ryan's military medical records had mentioned a concussion from his tree accident, but nothing had prepared Sarah for this level of medical emergency. The seizure lasted 90 seconds, she counted, before Ryan's body went limp and his breathing became deep and regular. Sarah checked his pulse and airway while Tommy hovered nearby, his face white with fear and confusion. "Is he going to die like Daddy?" Tommy whispered, and Sarah's heart broke a little more. "No, honey, this is different. He's going to be okay." She hoped she was telling the truth. Ryan's truck was unlocked, and Sarah found his wallet in the glove compartment along with a manila folder that fell open when she pulled it out. Military medical records scattered across the truck seat, revealing information that made her stomach clench with recognition and dread. Traumatic brain injury sustained in IED explosion, Kandahar province, she read aloud. Symptoms include seizures, memory impairment, emotional dysregulation. Patient exhibits signs of severe PTSD with associated depression and anxiety disorders. Recommended for medical discharge pending psychiatric evaluation. The picture that emerged from the scattered papers was of a soldier who'd been broken by war in ways that weren't immediately visible. Ryan Hale wasn't just a grateful survivor who'd come to thank her dog. He was a man struggling with invisible wounds that made civilian life feel impossible. The ambulance arrived within 20 minutes, and the paramedics worked with the efficient calm of people who'd seen medical emergencies of every description. They stabilized Ryan and prepared him for transport while Sarah stood nearby holding documents that revealed far more about his condition than he'd chosen to share. "You coming with us, ma'am?" the lead paramedic asked as they loaded Ryan into the ambulance. Sarah looked back at Tommy, who was standing in the farmhouse doorway with Buddy pressed against his legs. Her son had already lost one important man in his life to sudden medical crisis. Watching another one disappear into an ambulance was clearly triggering memories and fears that no 8-year-old should have to process. "We'll follow in our truck," she decided. The drive to the hospital gave Sarah time to process what she'd learned about Ryan's condition and what it meant for the stories she'd been telling herself about his presence on their farm. He hadn't just shown up to thank Buddy for saving his life. He'd been searching for something deeper, some sense of purpose and connection that his military discharge had stripped away. The medical records painted a picture of progressive deterioration over the past 80 months. Multiple concussions, increasing psychological symptoms, family relationships strained to the breaking point by his inability to readjust to civilian life. His parents had stopped visiting when his anger and isolation became too difficult to manage. Tommy sat quietly in the passenger seat, processing the afternoon's events with the kind of serious attention he brought to difficult problems. "Mom, is Ryan sick like the soldiers on TV?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. Tommy was smart enough to sense deception, but too young for the full complexity of what they'd witnessed. "He's hurt in ways that don't show on the outside," she said finally. "Sometimes people need help healing from things that happened to them. Like how I needed help when Daddy died." The comparison was unexpectedly accurate. Tommy had required months of counseling to process his father's death, learning to articulate feelings and fears that threatened to overwhelm his young emotional capacity. Ryan's struggles seemed to stem from similar sources: trauma, loss, and the challenge of rebuilding identity after everything familiar had been taken away. At the hospital, Ryan was conscious but disoriented, struggling to piece together recent events while medical personnel ran tests to assess the seizure's cause and implications. He recognized Sarah when she appeared in his room, but his embarrassment was obvious and painful to witness. "You found my medical records," he said. Noting the folder in her hands, Sarah nodded, unsure how to approach the conversation that needed to happen. "Why didn't you tell us about your condition?" Ryan turned toward the window, unable to meet her eyes. "Because nobody wants to deal with a broken soldier. I've been living in my truck for 3 weeks because my landlord decided I was too much of a liability. My parents won't return my phone calls because my episodes scare them. The admission hung between them like a confession that hurt to make and hurt to hear. Sarah began to understand that Ryan's visit to their farm represented more than gratitude. It was the act of someone desperately searching for a place where his presence might be welcome. "Tommy thinks you're a hero," she said quietly. "He's been telling everyone at school about the soldier his dog saved." Ryan's laugh held no humor. "Some hero. Can't hold a job, can't maintain relationships, can't even fix a fence without having a medical emergency." But Sarah was remembering the past 3 hours before his seizure, the careful attention Ryan had paid to the work, the way he'd explained each step to Tommy with infinite patience, the obvious pleasure he'd taken in useful physical labor. His condition didn't erase his competence or his fundamental decency. "Where were you planning to go after you left our farm?" she asked. Ryan shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than words. Hadn't figured that part out yet. The hospital social worker appeared in the doorway with the kind of clipboard that usually preceded difficult conversations about insurance, housing, and follow-up care. Ryan's medical needs were complex and ongoing, requiring resources that his veterans' benefits couldn't fully cover. Sarah made a decision that surprised her even as she voiced it. "You could stay with us for a while. Help around the farm while you get your medical situation stabilized." Ryan's expression shifted through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope. "You don't understand what you're offering. My condition isn't going to get better anytime soon." "I understand that you're the reason my dog came home," Sarah replied, "and that Tommy needs to see what it looks like when people don't give up on each other. It wasn't charity, though it might have looked like it from the outside." Sarah was beginning to recognize that Ryan's presence on their farm served purposes that went beyond gratitude or temporary assistance. Tommy needed male influence and guidance that she couldn't provide alone. The farm needed someone with Ryan's organizational skills and work ethic. And maybe, though she was barely ready to admit this to herself, she needed to remember what it felt like to care about someone's well-being again. The offer hung in the hospital room like a bridge across an impossible gap, connecting a broken soldier with a grieving family in ways that neither had expected but both desperately needed. Ryan's invisible wounds might never fully heal, but perhaps healing wasn't the only thing that mattered. Sometimes survival was enough. Sometimes showing up and staying was enough. Sometimes the most important thing was just refusing to let people disappear when disappearing would be easier for everyone involved. Outside the hospital window, Montana mountains stretched toward a sky that promised either storm or clear weather, depending on which direction you chose to look. The uncertainty felt appropriate for decisions being made without guarantees or clear outcomes, based on nothing more substantial than the hope that broken things might support each other long enough to become something stronger. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail with the kind of official letterhead that meant serious trouble. Sarah signed for it with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from caffeine or dread she couldn't say. Notice of default and election to sell under deed of trust. The document read in bold letters that seemed to echo through the quiet. Kitchen, you are hereby notified that a breach of the obligation for which this property was conveyed as security has occurred. 30 days. They had 30 days before the farm would be sold at public auction to satisfy debts that had been accumulating since David's death. Medical bills from his extended hospital stay, equipment loans that couldn't be serviced with reduced farm income, property taxes that had somehow slipped through the cracks of Sarah's increasingly complex financial juggling act. Sarah had been hiding the extent of their financial crisis from Tommy, maintaining the illusion that their struggles were temporary setbacks rather than existential threats. But 30 days didn't leave room for illusion or gradual revelation. The farm that had anchored 3 generations of Mitchell family life was about to slip away forever. She walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the barn where Ryan was teaching Tommy how to properly maintain farm equipment. The sight that should have brought comfort instead intensified her sense of failure. Here was a man who'd survived war and personal crisis, offering his skills and energy to help them succeed, while she couldn't even manage to keep their home. Tommy's laughter drifted through the morning air as Ryan demonstrated the proper way to sharpen mower blades. Her son had been happier in the past month than he'd been since David's death, and Ryan's presence had brought stability and purpose, but Sarah couldn't provide alone. But none of that would matter if they lost the farm. The numbers on the foreclosure notice were staggering larger than anything Sarah could have imagined accumulating. David's insurance had covered most of his medical expenses, but there had been gaps and exclusions that added up to tens of thousands of dollars. Combined with 2 years of reduced farm income and her inexperience with financial management, the debt had grown to overwhelming proportions. Ryan appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face flushed with the kind of honest satisfaction that comes from useful physical work. "Tommy's getting pretty good with those tools," he reported. "Kid's got natural mechanical aptitude." Sarah handed him the foreclosure notice without preamble, watching his expression change as he processed the legal language and financial details. His military training had included logistics and resource management, so he understood immediately what the numbers meant. "How long have you been dealing with this?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "The problems started after David died, but I thought I could manage them. I kept thinking if I just worked harder, made better decisions, found ways to increase income." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "I didn't want to admit how bad things had gotten." Ryan studied the document with the kind of analytical attention he'd once applied to battlefield intelligence. The debt was substantial, but not insurmountable if approached strategically. More importantly, he recognized the shame and isolation in Sarah's posture emotions he understood from his own recent experience with overwhelming problems. "What does Tommy know?" he asked. "Nothing. I've been trying to protect him from the worst of it." Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "He's already lost his father and been through so much trauma. I couldn't bear the thought of him losing his home too." But even as she spoke, both adults knew that secrets this large couldn't be maintained much longer. Tommy was intelligent and observant, already asking questions about why his mother looked worried all the time and why they couldn't afford things they used to take for granted. The sound of Buddy barking drew their attention to the window, where Tommy was throwing a tennis ball with the kind of energetic enthusiasm that belonged to childhood. The boy's happiness felt fragile and precious, something that needed to be protected at any cost. "I have money," Ryan said quietly. "Military savings, disability payments that I haven't been spending. It's not enough to solve the whole problem, but it might buy us time to figure out other solutions." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse what felt like charity from someone who had his own financial challenges. But the word "us" resonated in ways she hadn't expected. Ryan had positioned himself as part of their family's struggle rather than an outside observer offering assistance. "I can't ask you to risk your savings for our problems," she said. "You're not asking. I'm offering." Ryan's tone carried the kind of quiet authority that had made him an effective military leader. "This farm has been the first place I've felt useful since my discharge. Tommy's the first kid who's looked at me like I might be worth respecting instead of pitying. You've both given me something I'd forgotten I needed." The conversation was interrupted by Tommy bursting through the kitchen door, Buddy at his heels, and excitement radiating from every line of his small body. "Mom, Ryan showed me how to adjust the carburetor on the lawnmower, and it started on the first pull." His enthusiasm dimmed as he noticed the serious expressions and official-looking papers spread across the kitchen table. Tommy had developed sensitivity to adult tension that came from experiencing loss too early. "What's wrong?" he asked, moving protectively closer to Buddy. Sarah and Ryan exchanged glances, recognizing that they'd reached a moment where truth was unavoidable. Tommy deserved to know what threatened his security, even if the knowledge was frightening. "We're having some money troubles," Sarah said, carefully. "The bank is saying we might have to sell the farm to pay our debts." Tommy's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally the kind of desperate determination that reminded Sarah of David at his most stubborn. "No, we can't sell. This is our home. This is where Daddy lived." "I know, honey. We're going to try to find a way to keep it." But Tommy was already moving into problem-solving mode, his 8-year-old mind searching for solutions that adults might have missed. What if we had a big sale? Like when Mrs. Peterson sold all her husband's tools after he died. We could sell stuff we don't need. Ryan found himself smiling despite the gravity of their situation. Tommy's instinct to fight rather than surrender reminded him of qualities he'd valued in the best. Soldiers he'd known: courage in the face of overwhelming odds and refusal to accept defeat. "That's actually not a bad idea," Ryan said. "But we need to sell more than just extra stuff. We need community support. People willing to help a farm family stay on their land." The seed of an idea was forming in Ryan's mind, shaped by his military experience with logistics and community organizing. Veterans knew how to mobilize resources quickly when one of their own was in trouble. Farming communities had similar traditions of mutual support during crisis situations. "What if we organized a fundraising event?" he suggested. "Get the word out through veterans groups, farm organizations, social media. Tell your story and let people decide if they want to help." Sarah felt a flutter of hope mixed with embarrassment. The thought of publicizing their financial struggles felt like advertising failure, but the alternative was losing everything they'd worked to build. Tommy was already warming to the idea, his natural optimism overriding adult concerns about pride and privacy. "We could have it here on the farm. Show people all the cool stuff and let them meet Buddy and see why we need to stay." The plan began taking shape through the afternoon as they discussed logistics and strategy. Ryan's organizational skills proved invaluable. He understood how to coordinate complex operations, how to reach different communities effectively, and how to present their situation in ways that inspired support rather than pity. But underlying the practical planning was an emotional truth that none of them fully articulated. This had become about more than saving a farm. It was about preserving a place where broken things could heal, where a traumatized soldier could find purpose, and a grieving family could rebuild hope. The foreclosure notice still sat on the kitchen table, a 30-day countdown to potential disaster. But for the first time since receiving it, Sarah felt like they might have weapons to fight back with: community, determination, and the kind of stubborn love that refuses to accept defeat without a struggle. As evening approached and they continued planning their campaign to save the farm, Buddy settled contentedly at their feet, somehow understanding that the humans were working on something important. The golden retriever who'd brought them together had no way of knowing that his act of loyalty in a storm-torn forest had set in motion a chain of events that might save his home. But perhaps that's how the most important things happen, not through grand gestures or perfect planning, but through the accumulation of small faithfulness that eventually adds up to something powerful enough to change everything. Ryan's old unit commander arrived on Thursday morning driving a pickup truck loaded with donated items and carrying a bronze military challenge coin that had been given to him by a soldier who didn't survive the journey home. Colonel Mike Harrison looked older than Ryan remembered, worn by the weight of decisions that had sent young men and women into harm's way. But his handshake was firm, and his eyes held the kind of understanding that only came from shared experience. "Ed, you were in a tight spot," Harrison said without preamble. The boys at the base took up a collection. The truck bed was filled with everything from household goods to farm equipment, donated by soldiers who understood what it meant to fight for something worth saving. A new chainsaw, bags of feed, tools, and even a refurbished riding mower that someone had restored specifically for the cause. But more valuable than the material donations was what Harrison represented: validation that Ryan's struggle mattered to people who knew him as a soldier rather than a casualty. The military challenge coin he pressed into Ryan's palm carried weight beyond its bronze composition. "This was Martinez's," Harrison explained, referring to Ryan's former squad leader who died in an IED explosion 6 months after Ryan's injury. "His wife wanted you to have it. Said he always talked about the soldier who never gave up on anybody." Ryan turned the coin over in his palm, reading the inscription, "Brothers in arms, no one left behind." The motto that had defined his military service now seemed to apply to civilian life in ways he hadn't expected. Sarah watched this exchange from the farmhouse porch, beginning to understand that Ryan's presence on their farm represented more than individual gratitude or personal healing. He'd connected their family crisis to a broader network of people who understood loyalty and mutual support in ways that transcended ordinary community relationships. Tommy emerged from the barn leading Buddy on a makeshift leash he'd crafted from rope, his face bright with the kind of excitement that had been missing from his daily routine since his father's death. "Ryan, look what I taught Buddy. He can heel and sit and even shake hands." The dog demonstrations provided a welcome break from the intensity of fundraising preparations, and Harrison found himself charmed by Tommy's obvious pride in his four-legged companion. "That's the dog that saved your life?" he asked Ryan. "Best soldier I ever served with," Ryan replied, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "Never broke under pressure, never abandoned his post, never asked for anything in return." The comparison wasn't entirely facetious. Buddy had demonstrated qualities that military training tried to instill in human soldiers: loyalty, persistence, courage under adverse conditions, and willingness to risk personal safety for others. His actions in the storm-torn forest had been as heroic as anything Ryan had witnessed in combat. Local veterans began arriving throughout the day, drawn by word-of-mouth networks that operated with surprising efficiency in rural communities. Men and women who'd served in different wars and different branches of the military, united by understanding of what it meant to fight for something larger than individual survival. Sarah found herself cooking for a crowd that grew steadily larger. As afternoon approached, her kitchen became command central for an operation that combined military logistics with farming community traditions of mutual support during crisis situations. "Ma'am, we've got 3 more pickup trucks coming from the VFW in Kalispell," reported a Vietnam veteran who'd taken charge of coordinating arrivals, "and the farm bureaus sending representatives to help spread the word." But the most important arrival was Tommy's growing sense of wonder at the number of people who cared about their family's welfare. He moved through the crowd with Buddy at his side, listening to stories about his father from neighbors who remembered David's generosity and work ethic. "Your dad helped me get my hay in when I broke my leg," an elderly farmer told Tommy. "Never asked for anything in return, just showed up with his equipment and worked until the job was done." These stories were revelation to Tommy, who'd been too young when David died to fully understand his father's reputation in the community. Hearing about David's character from people who'd known him as a friend and neighbor rather than just a father added new dimensions to his grief and his pride. Ryan observed these interactions with the kind of analytical attention that military service had trained him to apply to complex social situations. He was watching a community rally around values that transcended individual self-interest: loyalty, mutual support, and collective responsibility for members who faced overwhelming challenges. But he was also monitoring his own psychological state, aware that crowds and noise could trigger symptoms that would be embarrassing and potentially dangerous. The challenge coin in his pocket felt like a tangible reminder of his identity as a soldier, but it also represented the expectations that came with that identity. Sarah appeared at his elbow with a cup of coffee, and a kind of observant expression that suggested she'd been watching him carefully. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "So far, so good," Ryan replied, though they both knew that his condition made gatherings like this unpredictable. "If I need to step away, I'll let you know." The honesty in their exchange reflected how much their relationship had evolved over the past month. Sarah had learned to read the signs of Ryan's increasing stress, while he'd learned to communicate his needs rather than trying to manage symptoms alone. Tommy bounded over with news that the local radio station wanted to interview him about Buddy's heroic rescue mission. They want to know how it feels to have the bravest dog in Montana. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but so was his growing confidence in situations that would have overwhelmed him just weeks earlier. Ryan's presence had provided male mentorship that helped Tommy navigate challenges with increasing independence and self-assurance. "What are you going to tell them?" Sarah asked. Tommy considered the question with the seriousness he brought to important problems. "I'm going to tell him that Buddy knows how to love people even when he doesn't know them yet. And that sometimes the best thing you can do is just stay with someone when they need help." The answer captured something essential about the lessons Tommy had learned from watching Ryan and Buddy's relationship develop. Loyalty wasn't complicated or conditional. It was simply the decision to remain present when presence mattered most. As afternoon wore on and the crowd continued to grow, Ryan found himself remembering why he'd chosen military service in the first place. It hadn't been about weapons or combat or even patriotism in the abstract sense. It had been about belonging to something larger than individual survival, about being part of a community where people looked out for each other, regardless of personal cost. The Mitchell farm was providing that same sense of purpose and belonging, but in a context that felt sustainable rather than temporarily heroic. This was daily life organized around principles that made daily life worth living: care for the land, protection of family, loyalty to community, and the quiet heroism of showing up consistently for people who needed you. The challenge coin grew warm in his palm as he watched Tommy demonstrate Buddy's tricks for an audience of veterans who understood exactly why a dog's faithfulness could mean the difference between life and death. Sometimes salvation came in the form you expected, but sometimes it came wearing a golden coat and wagging tail, refusing to abandon someone even when abandoning would be easier. The farm deed felt heavier than its actual weight when the bank representative placed it on the kitchen table Saturday morning, 30 minutes before the fundraising event was scheduled to begin. Mr. Peterson from First National Bank of Montana had arrived with the kind of grim expression that suggested he took no pleasure in foreclosure proceedings. But business was business. "I'm sorry it's come to this, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, arranging legal documents with practiced efficiency. "The bank has been as patient as possible, but the numbers just don't work anymore." Sarah stared at the deed that represented 3 generations of Mitchell family history: her great-grandfather's original homestead claim, her grandfather's expansion during the prosperous post-war years, David's dreams of passing sustainable farming practices to their son. All of it reduced to legal language about default and liquidation. Outside, volunteers were setting up tables and sound equipment while early arrivals wandered the property with the kind of respectful curiosity that accompanies community tragedy. Cars lined the county road for half a mile in both directions, testament to how quickly word had spread through networks of veterans, farmers, and neighbors who understood what was at stake. Ryan appeared in the doorway, his face carefully controlled, but his hands betraying tension that suggested he was fighting to maintain psychological equilibrium. The growing crowd represented exactly the kind of chaotic environment that could trigger his PTSD symptoms, but he was determined to see this through. "Mr. Peterson," Ryan said, extending his hand with military courtesy. "Ryan Hale, I understand. You're here about the foreclosure." Peterson nodded, noting Ryan's obvious military bearing and the way Sarah seemed to defer to his presence during what was clearly a family crisis. I'm afraid the legal requirements don't allow for much flexibility. Without full payment by 5 o'clock today, the property goes to auction Monday morning. The amount due was staggering more than $60,000, including penalties and legal fees. Even with the donations that had been flowing in and Ryan's personal contribution, they were still short by nearly half. Tommy burst through the kitchen door with Buddy at his heels, his face flushed with excitement that dimmed. When he saw the adults' serious expressions and the legal papers spread across the table, "Are we losing the farm?" he asked with the kind of direct honesty that adults often avoided in difficult situations. Sarah knelt to meet her son's eyes, choosing words that acknowledged reality without destroying hope. "We're trying very hard to keep it, honey. A lot of people are here to help us." But Tommy was studying the bank representative with the kind of analytical attention he'd inherited from his father. "Are you the one who wants to take our house?" Peterson shifted uncomfortably under the boy's direct gaze. "I don't want to take anything, son. It's just business. Sometimes people can't pay their debts, and my daddy's dead," Tommy interrupted, with matter-of-fact clarity that made all the adults flinch. "He didn't choose to die and leave us with money problems. Sometimes bad things happen that aren't anybody's fault." The 8-year-old's wisdom hung in the kitchen, air like an indictment of systems that reduced human suffering to spreadsheet calculations. Peterson cleared his throat and returned his attention to the legal documents, but something had shifted in his posture. Outside, the sound of vehicles arriving intensified as the 11 o'clock start time approached. Ryan moved to the window and felt his chest tighten as he watched the crowd grow larger and more chaotic. Veterans in American Legion, caps mixed with farm families, local business owners, and curious onlookers drawn by the human interest story that had captured regional media attention. "I need some air," Ryan told Sarah, recognizing the warning signs of an approaching panic attack. Sarah nodded understanding, having learned to read the symptoms that preceded his episodes. "Take Buddy with you. He helps." Ryan stepped onto the back porch with the golden retriever beside him, grateful for the relative quiet away from the crowd. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his heart rate elevated despite the absence of any actual threat. The irony wasn't lost on him that a soldier who'd survived multiple combat deployments was being undone by a community fundraiser. Buddy seemed to sense his distress and pressed against Ryan's legs with the kind of steady pressure that grounded him in physical reality rather than psychological chaos. The dog's presence provided an anchor point that helped Ryan focus on immediate sensations rather than overwhelming stimuli. The sound system crackled to life as volunteers tested microphones and speakers, preparing for presentations that would tell the Mitchell family's story to potential donors. Sarah's voice drifted through the farmhouse windows as she practiced her remarks, trying to find words that conveyed their situation without sounding like begging. "We're not asking for charity," she rehearsed. "We're asking for the chance to keep working, to keep contributing to this community that has given us so much." But Ryan knew that pride was a luxury they couldn't afford if they wanted to save the farm. His military savings account contained nearly $15,000 money. He'd been hoarding against an uncertain future, and he'd already decided to contribute every penny regardless of the personal financial risk. Tommy appeared on the porch carrying a glass of water and wearing the kind of determined expression that reminded Ryan of soldiers preparing for difficult missions. "Ryan, you don't look good. Are you having one of your episodes?" The boy's directness was both startling and comforting. Tommy had learned to identify and name Ryan's psychological symptoms without judgment or fear, treating them as medical realities rather than character flaws. "Yeah, buddy. I'm struggling a bit with all the people and noise." Tommy settled beside him on the porch steps, Buddy positioning himself between them like a furry mediator. "Mom gets scared about the farm, but she tries not to show it. I get scared about you leaving, but I try not to show it either." The admission hit Ryan harder than any direct question about his intentions. Tommy had already lost one father figure to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The thought of disappointing this boy who'd learned to trust again felt unbearable. "I'm not going anywhere," Ryan said, meaning it completely. "This is home now." The crowd noise increased as the official program began, but from their position on the back porch, they could hear Sarah's voice through the sound system as she told their story with the kind of quiet dignity that made tragedy sound like opportunity for community response. "My husband David died believing that land is something you borrow from your children," Sarah said. "We're asking for help to keep that borrowing arrangement intact." Applause drifted across the farmyard, followed by the kinds of testimonials that small communities provide when one of their own faces crisis. Neighbors shared stories of David's generosity, Ryan's military service, and Buddy's heroic rescue mission that had brought them all together. But the real test would come when they tallied donations against the amount needed to satisfy the bank's demands. Peterson had agreed to wait until 5 o'clock, but his presence served as constant reminder that sentiment couldn't override legal obligations. Ryan felt his breathing slow as the immediate crisis of his panic attack passed. Buddy's steady presence and Tommy's matter-of-fact acceptance of his condition had provided exactly the kind of grounding he needed to function through overwhelming circumstances. "Ready to go face the crowd?" Tommy asked, standing and brushing dust from his jeans. Ryan nodded, surprised to discover that the prospect no longer felt quite so intimidating. Having someone who needed him to be brave made being brave feel possible, even when brave was the last thing he felt like being. As they walked around the farmhouse toward the main gathering, Ryan understood that today wasn't just about saving the Mitchell farm. It was about proving that broken things could still be useful, that damaged people could still contribute meaningfully to something larger than their individual healing. The farm deed still waited on the kitchen table, but for the first time since the foreclosure notice arrived, Ryan believed they might actually have enough community support to keep it where it belonged. 6 months after the fundraising event that saved the Mitchell farm, Ryan woke to the sound of Buddy barking at something in the pre-dawn darkness. His first instinct was the hypervigilance that had defined his post-military existence, but the familiar surroundings of his room in the farmhouse quickly oriented him to reality that no longer felt fragile or temporary. The golden retriever was alerting them to a cow that had wandered through a gap in the fence, a routine problem that required simple solutions rather than combat-level threat assessment. Ryan pulled on work clothes and headed outside, grateful for the kind of purposeful emergency that made sense in the context of daily farm life. Sarah was already in the kitchen when he returned, coffee brewing and breakfast preparations underway. With the kind of efficient domesticity that had evolved naturally over their months of shared responsibility, the relationship between them had developed slowly, built on practical partnership and mutual respect rather than dramatic romance. "How's the new therapy protocol working?" she asked, noting the steadiness in his movements that indicated a good night's sleep. "Better," Ryan admitted. The Veterans Administration had finally approved intensive PTSD treatment that combined medication with specialized counseling, and the improvement in his daily functioning was undeniable. "I actually slept through the night without nightmares." Tommy appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing pajamas, his hair disheveled and his face bearing the kind of contentment that belonged to children who felt completely secure in their environment. At 9 years old, he'd grown taller and more confident, but his attachment to both Ryan and Buddy remained the center of his emotional universe. "Ryan, are you going to show me how to drive the tractor today?" Tommy asked with the kind of hopeful enthusiasm that made refusing impossible. "After you finish your homework and help your mom with the chickens," Ryan replied, establishing the same expectations that David might have set for balancing responsibility with adventure. The farm was thriving in ways that went beyond financial stability. Ryan's military organizational skills had streamlined operations, while his mechanical knowledge had solved chronic equipment problems that had plagued Sarah since David's death. More importantly, his presence had allowed Tommy to experience male mentorship that honored his father's memory, while providing guidance for his developing independence. The adoption papers had been finalized 3 months earlier, making Ryan officially Tommy's stepfather, and providing legal framework for the family structure that had evolved organically through shared crisis and mutual support. Tommy had requested the adoption himself, understanding that formal recognition would ensure Ryan's permanent place in their family. "Dad," Tommy said, testing the title that still felt new to all of them, "when do you think Buddy will be old enough to help with herding?" Ryan smiled at the question that revealed Tommy's growing understanding of farm operations and long-term planning. Dogs usually start training around 18 months, so Buddy's got plenty of time to learn. But he's already showing good instincts for livestock work. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's cell phone ringing with a call from the local elementary school. Tommy's teacher wanted to discuss his participation in the upcoming science fair, where he planned to present a project about animal behavior based on his observations of Buddy's rescue instincts. He's been interviewing veterans about military working dogs, the teacher explained. The depth of his research is really impressive for a 4th grader. Sarah felt the kind of pride that comes from watching a child translate personal experience into academic achievement. Tommy's project represented his attempt to understand the broader context of loyalty and service that had shaped his family's story, but the real measure of their healing wasn't found in specific achievements or milestones. It was evident in the daily rhythms of a household where 3 people and 1 dog had learned to function as an integrated family unit. Ryan's morning seizure medication had become as routine as Tommy's vitamins, while Sarah's evening anxiety about finances had been replaced by collaborative planning sessions where all 3 adults, Ryan, Sarah, and increasingly Tommy, contributed to decision-making about farm operations. The new wedding rings they'd chosen were simple gold bands engraved with their wedding date, but also with a symbol that honored the golden retriever who'd brought them together. Buddy's paw print was etched discreetly on the inside of each ring, a private reminder of the loyalty that had made their love possible. Ryan's relationship with his own parents had slowly improved through weekly phone calls that focused on farm life rather than his medical condition. His mother planned to visit for Tommy's birthday, her first trip to Montana since Ryan's military discharge. The prospect of hosting his parents no longer triggered anxiety about their judgment of his choices or capabilities. "Your father wants to know if there's anything he can help with around the farm," his mother had said during their most recent conversation. "He's been watching YouTube videos about modern farming techniques." The image of his retired accountant father researching agricultural methods represented healing that Ryan hadn't dared to hope for during his darkest months. His parents' acceptance of his new life had required time and evidence, but their willingness to engage with his chosen path suggested forgiveness for the years when his condition had made relationships nearly impossible. The farm itself bore evidence of their combined efforts: new fencing that would last for decades, equipment that operated efficiently, and crop rotations that promised sustainable productivity. But more importantly, it felt like home in ways that went beyond mere function or financial stability. Tommy's room contained relics from his life, with David photographs, tools, and mementos that honored his biological father's memory, alongside newer additions that reflected his relationship with Ryan. Military challenge coins sat next to 4-H ribbons, while camping gear shared space with farm equipment models. Sarah had kept David's wedding ring in a jewelry box, but she no longer turned it when she was nervous. The nervous habit had been replaced by confidence that came from successfully managing complex challenges with reliable partnership. Her new ring caught morning sunlight as she prepared breakfast for a family that has assembled itself through crisis and commitment rather than conventional courtship. The golden retriever who'd initiated their family's transformation was now approaching his 5th birthday, fully mature and completely integrated into farm operations. Buddy had developed into exactly the kind of working dog that David had envisioned: intelligent, loyal, and capable of independent judgment during emergency situations. But his most important role remained unchanged: faithful companion who demonstrated daily that love sometimes requires nothing more complicated than showing up consistently and refusing to abandon people when abandoning would be easier. As Ryan headed outside to begin another day of farm work, he paused to scratch behind Buddy's ears and whisper the kind of gratitude that still felt too large for words. "Thanks for not giving up on me, boy." The golden retriever's tail wagged with the same enthusiasm he'd shown during that terrible night in the storm-torn forest, when staying had been the difference between life and death for a soldier who'd forgotten how to ask for help. Now, 6 months later, all of them understood that salvation rarely comes in the form expected, but it always comes wearing the face of someone who chooses to stay when staying matters most. The Mitchell farm remained in the family that had worked it for 3 generations, but it was also home to new definitions of family that honored both loss and healing, military service and civilian life, individual struggle and collective support. Ryan's dog tags still hung from the bedpost in his room, but they no longer represented the only identity available to him. He was also a husband, stepfather, farmer, and community member whose value extended far beyond his military service or his medical condition. The farm deed remained safely filed in Sarah's desk, but its real security came from the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth rebuilding around when circumstances threaten to destroy everything familiar. And sometimes, when the morning light hits the Montana mountains just right and a golden retriever races across pastures that stretch toward distant horizons, it's possible to believe that broken things can indeed become stronger, that loyalty can overcome any obstacle, and that the most profound acts of heroism happen not in moments of dramatic rescue, but in the daily decision to keep loving people who need love most.